Go ahead and laugh, the woman said quietly, her voice calm enough to make the entire executive terminal fall silent. Sometimes the loudest mistake begins with the smallest assumption. The words hung in the air inside the private aviation terminal just outside Dallas, where polished marble floors reflected the afternoon sunlight pouring through walls of glass overlooking a row of immaculate business jets. Executives reviewed presentations before departures, pilots discussed weather briefings with dispatchers, and flight attendants carried fresh coffee toward waiting crews. It was the kind of place where confidence rarely needed to be announced because everyone seemed to arrive already expecting respect. That rhythm changed the moment Naomi Carter walked through the entrance carrying nothing more than a premium leather travel bag. At 44 years old, Naomi preferred practical travel clothes over designer labels. A navy jacket, dark jeans, and spotless white sneakers attracted almost no attention as she approached the reception counter with an easy smile. Her movements were unhurried, her posture relaxed, and her eyes quietly observed every detail around her. "Good afternoon," she said warmly. "I am Naomi Carter. Please let ground operations know I have arrived. My aircraft is scheduled for departure." Airport manager Diane Brooks looked up from her computer screen, studying Naomi for a moment before offering a polite smile that quickly transformed into an amused laugh. "Your aircraft?" she asked loudly enough for nearby travelers to hear. Several heads turned toward the reception desk. "Yes," Naomi answered with the same steady tone. "Please notify ground operations that I have checked in." Diane leaned back in her chair. "Ma'am, private aircraft departures are handled through scheduled flight departments. If you are looking for charter information, I can direct you to another office." Naomi gently shook her head. "I am not requesting a charter. I am requesting confirmation of my arrival." Diane tapped several keys on her keyboard before glancing back at the screen. "I do not see anything that matches your request." Naomi nodded once. "Then please contact ground operations directly." Diane smiled again, clearly convinced there was nothing further to verify. Around the lounge, quiet conversations began to fade as more travelers noticed the unusual exchange. A retired airline captain folded his newspaper. A young entrepreneur removed one earbud while pretending to continue reading emails. Two pilots walking toward the crew lounge slowed their pace just enough to hear another sentence. Naomi never raised her voice. Years of leading complex negotiations had taught her that composure often revealed more strength than argument ever could. "I appreciate your help," she said. "A quick confirmation will resolve everything." Diane folded her arms. "Our system is accurate," Naomi answered with a calm expression that never changed. "Systems are only as accurate as the information they receive." For just a brief moment, neither woman spoke. Through the enormous windows behind them, a sleek Gulfstream waited on the ramp beneath the bright Texas sky. Ground crews completed routine inspections while the cabin door remained open. Somewhere beyond the terminal walls, flight operations had already begun preparing for a departure that depended on one final confirmation. Inside the lounge, no one yet understood why the conversation at the reception desk felt strangely important. They only sensed that the woman standing quietly beside her travel bag carried a confidence that did not need to introduce itself. As another phone began ringing somewhere behind the secured operations hallway, Naomi simply waited, knowing that patience often arrived at the destination before recognition ever did. Naomi did not repeat her request. She simply rested one hand on the handle of her leather travel bag and waited with the kind of patience that could only come from years of experience. Around the executive lounge, conversations slowly faded until the soft music overhead became more noticeable than the voices of the travelers themselves. Diane Brooks continued looking at her computer screen with complete confidence, occasionally typing another search before glancing back at Naomi, as though expecting her to admit that the situation had been a misunderstanding. Instead, Naomi remained exactly where she stood, relaxed, courteous, and completely unshaken. "If you contact ground operations," Naomi said gently, "they will immediately recognize my arrival." Diane offered another polite smile. "Ground operations manages aircraft movement. They do not verify personal travel requests." Naomi nodded slightly. "That is correct, which is why they should receive my name." Diane folded her arms. "I believe we have already answered your question." Naomi looked through the towering glass windows toward the waiting Gulfstream, resting quietly on the ramp beneath the warm Texas afternoon sky. A fuel truck had already pulled away from the aircraft. The catering vehicle finished its final delivery. Two pilots reviewed departure paperwork near the aircraft stairs, while a line technician completed another routine inspection. Everything appeared ready except for one missing confirmation. Inside the lounge, a young customer service trainee named Ethan quietly watched the conversation unfold. Something about Naomi's calm confidence made him hesitate before returning to his desk. After a moment, he stepped toward Diane and spoke softly enough that only she could hear. "Would you like me to make a quick call to operations, just to confirm?" Diane answered without looking away from her monitor. "There is nothing to confirm." Ethan nodded respectfully, although uncertainty remained on his face. Across the lounge, an older businessman lowered his tablet and whispered to the retired airline captain sitting nearby. "She does not seem nervous." The captain smiled faintly. People who know exactly where they belong rarely are. Naomi heard neither comment because her attention remained focused outside. She had traveled through hundreds of executive terminals during her career and understood that airports operated through procedures. She respected those procedures because they existed for safety and precision. That was exactly why she continued requesting verification instead of demanding special treatment. A telephone rang somewhere beyond the secured operations hallway. Another employee crossed the corridor carrying a tablet before disappearing behind a restricted access door. A few moments later, a faint radio transmission echoed from the operations office. None of the travelers could understand the words, but several employees instinctively turned toward the sound. Diane ignored the activity and returned her attention to Naomi. "If you are waiting for transportation, the seating area is available." Naomi smiled politely. "Thank you. I am waiting for confirmation." At nearly the same moment, deep inside the airport operations center, a dispatcher studied the departure board with a puzzled expression. Every item connected to one Gulfstream flight had already been completed except passenger arrival verification. He pressed the transmit button on his radio. "Operations to Executive Terminal. Can anyone confirm whether Ms. Naomi Carter has checked in?" The question traveled quietly across the airport communication network while, only a short distance away, the woman everyone was searching for continued standing calmly beside the reception desk, patiently waiting for someone to make the one phone call that would change the atmosphere of the entire terminal. "Mindaviet Teep Part 3 Theo Dungu Kava Dindang." Edit. The dispatcher repeated the transmission, his calm voice traveling through the airport communication network with quiet urgency. "Operations to Executive Terminal. Can anyone confirm whether Ms. Naomi Carter has arrived?" Inside the reception area, no one outside the secured offices could hear the full message, but employees passing through the operations hallway noticeably quickened their pace. Naomi remained standing beside the reception desk exactly where she had been since entering the terminal, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, and her attention occasionally drifting toward the waiting Gulfstream beyond the glass. Diane Brooks continued believing the matter had already been resolved. She closed one screen on her computer and opened another before looking back at Naomi. "Ma'am, I have checked every scheduled departure assigned to this desk. There is no additional information I can provide." Naomi answered with the same quiet confidence that had defined every word she had spoken that afternoon. "I understand. That is why I asked you to verify through ground operations." Diane smiled politely. "There is no reason to involve another department." Naomi simply nodded. "That is your decision." Those 4 words carried no frustration, no challenge, and no sarcasm. Their simplicity somehow made the surrounding silence even more noticeable. Across the lounge, the retired airline captain folded his newspaper completely and watched the reception desk with growing curiosity. A young technology executive closed his laptop. 2 pilots walking toward the crew entrance slowed almost imperceptibly after hearing Naomi's name mentioned again. Ethan quietly approached the reception counter once more. "Would you like me to contact operations?" he asked in a respectful voice. "It would only take a minute." Diane answered immediately. "No, we already have the information we need." Ethan hesitated before returning to his workstation, unable to explain why the conversation continued to trouble him. Outside on the ramp, the captain assigned to the waiting Gulfstream looked at the departure clock mounted inside the cockpit. Every checklist had been completed. Fuel levels had been verified. Weather conditions remained favorable. The flight attendants had prepared the cabin, and catering had already finished loading refreshments. Only one item remained highlighted on the electronic departure screen: passenger arrival confirmation. The captain pressed the radio switch. Operations, cockpit. Do we have an updated arrival status? The reply came back almost instantly. Negative. Reception has not confirmed the passenger. The captain looked through the cockpit window toward the executive terminal. Interesting, he murmured softly. We have never waited this long for a confirmed arrival. Back inside the building, another employee emerged from the secured hallway carrying a tablet. He paused near Ethan and quietly asked, "Has anyone actually spoken with Ms. Naomi Carter?" Ethan glanced toward Naomi before answering. "She has been standing here the entire time." The employee looked surprised, but was called away before asking another question. Moments later, another telephone rang behind the operations door, followed almost immediately by a second one. Diane barely looked up. Naomi remained patient, neither checking her watch nor reaching for her phone. She had long ago learned that confidence did not require constant reminders of importance. It only required consistency. Through the massive terminal windows, the afternoon sun reflected brilliantly across the polished fuselage of the waiting aircraft, while ground crews exchanged puzzled looks, wondering why a departure that was completely ready continued to remain perfectly still. Deep inside the control center, another supervisor studied the delay report, then quietly made a decision. "If reception cannot confirm Ms. Carter within the next few minutes," he said, "notify the airport director immediately. We need to find the passenger everyone else seems to be missing." The executive terminal gradually settled into an unusual silence that no one could quite explain. Naomi Carter remained beside the reception desk with the same calm expression she had carried since walking through the front entrance. She neither checked her phone nor looked impatient. Instead, she quietly watched the activity outside as sunlight reflected across the polished wings of the waiting Gulfstream. On the ramp, every member of the flight crew had completed their responsibilities. The captain reviewed the weather briefing one final time. The first officer confirmed the flight route. A line technician disconnected the external power unit before reconnecting it again after receiving another instruction to remain on standby. Every procedure had reached its final stage except one. Passenger confirmation still remained incomplete. Inside the operations center, another radio transmission echoed across the communication network. "Status update on Flight 718. A dispatcher answered immediately. "Aircraft is fully prepared. Departure delayed pending passenger verification." The controller frowned. "How long has the confirmation been outstanding?" "Nearly 30 minutes. The controller looked down at the departure schedule before replying quietly. "Continue attempting contact with the executive terminal." Back inside the lounge, Diane Brooks organized several folders across the reception counter as though nothing unusual had happened. She glanced toward Naomi and offered a professional smile. "I hope you understand that we simply follow procedure." Naomi nodded politely. "I respect procedure. That is exactly why I asked for verification." Diane answered with complete confidence. "Our records have already provided that verification." Naomi did not argue. "Records are valuable. Confirmation is better." Ethan listened carefully from the neighboring workstation. The simple sentence lingered in his mind. He had worked at the terminal for only a few months, but one lesson had already become clear. Experienced professionals rarely sounded defensive. They sounded certain without becoming loud. Naomi fit that description perfectly. Across the lounge, several travelers continued observing the quiet exchange. An investment advisor closed his briefcase. A retired airline captain leaned back in his chair and smiled thoughtfully. "Interesting," he whispered to the businessman beside him. "The calmest person in the room usually knows something the rest of us do not." Outside, another ground operations specialist walked toward the waiting aircraft carrying a tablet. He stopped beside the captain. "Still nothing?" the captain asked. The specialist shook his head. "Reception has not confirmed her arrival." The captain looked toward the executive terminal through the cockpit windows. "Then why does operations keep asking for the same passenger?" Neither man had an answer. Back inside the building, another employee emerged from the secured hallway carrying a headset around his neck. He approached Ethan quietly. "Has anyone seen Ms. Naomi Carter?" Ethan looked directly toward Naomi before answering. She has been standing here the entire afternoon. The employee blinked with surprise and instinctively turned toward Diane. Before he could ask another question, his radio crackled again. Return to operations immediately. He nodded and hurried back through the restricted doorway. Diane watched him leave, but remained convinced that everything was under control. Naomi continued waiting with remarkable patience, never attempting to interrupt the process or introduce herself beyond the simple request she had made from the beginning. Deep inside the control center, the operations supervisor studied the delay report one final time before reaching for a secure telephone. "This has gone beyond a routine verification," he said. "Please notify the airport director. We need executive assistance immediately because the passenger everyone has been searching for should have been here by now, and something about this situation no longer makes sense." The secure telephone call reached the airport director only seconds after the operations supervisor ended the report. He listened without interrupting, asked only 2 brief questions, then closed the folder on his desk and stood immediately. "The passenger has still not been confirmed?" he asked. "No, sir," came the reply. "Reception continues reporting that she has not arrived, but every operational record indicates she should already be inside the executive terminal." The director thanked the supervisor and headed toward the private terminal with a calm expression that concealed the urgency of the situation. Years of aviation management had taught him that delays rarely began with aircraft. They usually began with information. Inside the executive lounge, Naomi remained exactly where she had been standing since the afternoon began. Her leather travel bag rested beside her, and she quietly watched another business jet lift gracefully into the bright Texas sky. She showed no sign of frustration. She had built an entire career by understanding that patience often revealed the truth faster than arguments ever could. Diane Brooks continued organizing paperwork behind the reception desk, convinced she had followed every required procedure. "Everything has already been checked," she quietly told Ethan after noticing his concerned expression. Ethan nodded politely, but his eyes drifted once again toward Naomi. Something about the situation refused to make sense. Outside on the ramp, the captain of the waiting Gulfstream reviewed the departure clock for the 3rd time. Every checklist displayed green. Fuel was complete. Weather remained favorable. Cabin preparation was complete. Catering was complete. Crew readiness was complete. The only remaining item still highlighted on the electronic display read passenger confirmation pending. The captain pressed his headset switch once more. "Operations, cockpit. Do we have any update?" "Executive management has been notified," the dispatcher answered. "Please continue holding your current position." The captain exchanged a puzzled look with the first officer. This aircraft has never waited this long after final preparation. Back inside the terminal, another operations employee hurried through the secured hallway carrying a printed manifest. He paused briefly near the reception counter before looking toward Naomi. His expression suggested recognition, but before he could approach her, his radio interrupted him again. "Return immediately. Director is en route." He nodded and disappeared through the restricted doorway. Several travelers who had quietly followed the afternoon's events now openly watched the reception area. The retired airline captain folded his newspaper and placed it beside his coffee. "Someone important is about to arrive," he said softly. The businessman sitting nearby smiled. "I think the important person has already been here all afternoon." Naomi heard neither remark because her attention remained fixed on the aircraft outside. Diane noticed the growing curiosity around the lounge and attempted to restore a sense of routine by answering incoming calls and reviewing departure schedules. Yet even she could not ignore how frequently operations continued requesting the same passenger. Another phone rang behind the secured offices. Another radio transmission echoed faintly through the hallway. The atmosphere inside the terminal felt different now, as though every department in the airport had begun focusing on one unanswered question. A few moments later, the entrance doors opened quietly. The airport director stepped inside carrying only a slim folder and calmly surveyed the reception area. His eyes moved across the lounge for only an instant before stopping on the woman standing peacefully beside her leather travel bag. Without hesitation, he began walking directly toward Naomi while every conversation inside the executive terminal faded into complete silence. The airport director crossed the polished marble floor without slowing his pace, his attention fixed entirely on Naomi Carter. Employees instinctively stepped aside as he approached, and the quiet conversations that had filled the executive lounge disappeared completely. Naomi turned toward him with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the afternoon. Before anyone else could speak, the director extended his hand with a warm smile. "Ms. Carter," he said, "thank you for your patience. We have been trying to locate you." Naomi shook his hand politely. "Good afternoon. I have been here since I arrived." The simple exchange seemed to stop time inside the terminal. Ethan looked from Naomi to the director with unmistakable surprise. The retired airline captain slowly lowered his coffee cup. Even the travelers who had only been casually watching now understood that something far more significant had been unfolding than a routine travel delay. Diane Brooks remained behind the reception desk, momentarily speechless. She had expected the airport director to ask questions. Instead, he had greeted Naomi as though they had known each other for years. "Your aircraft has been fully prepared," the director continued. "Operations has delayed departure because they could not complete your arrival confirmation." Naomi nodded gently. "I requested that ground operations be contacted." The director's expression became thoughtful. "I understand." He turned toward the reception counter, not with anger, but with quiet professionalism. "Can someone explain why the requested verification was never completed?" Diane hesitated before answering. "Based on the information available to me, I believe there had been a misunderstanding." The director listened carefully before responding. "In aviation, assumptions never replace verification." His voice remained calm, yet every employee in the lounge immediately recognized the importance of those words. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly, remembering how close he had come to making the confirmation call himself. Naomi offered no criticism and made no attempt to embarrass anyone. She simply stood beside her travel bag, allowing the conversation to unfold naturally. Outside, the waiting Gulfstream finally received an updated message across the operations network. The captain smiled as the notification appeared on the flight display. "Passenger confirmed," he announced. "Proceeding with boarding sequence." Ground crew members immediately resumed activity around the aircraft. The boarding stairs were repositioned, final exterior inspections were completed, and the cabin crew prepared to welcome their passenger. Inside the terminal, another radio transmission quietly confirmed that the departure delay had officially ended. The atmosphere changed almost instantly. Employees who had spent the last half hour searching for answers finally understood why every department had been asking the same question. The director looked back at Naomi with genuine appreciation. "I apologize for the unnecessary delay. Thank you for remaining patient throughout the process." Naomi smiled warmly. Every system works best when everyone follows the same commitment to accuracy. The director nodded. "I could not agree more." Around the executive lounge, travelers exchanged thoughtful glances. No dramatic announcement had been necessary. No one had raised a voice. The truth had revealed itself simply because the proper verification had finally taken place. Diane quietly reflected on everything that had happened, realizing that confidence without confirmation could easily create avoidable mistakes. As Naomi lifted her leather travel bag and prepared to walk toward the boarding entrance beside the airport director, every person watching understood that the quiet woman who had never demanded special treatment had demonstrated a far more memorable kind of leadership than any introduction or title ever could. The executive terminal felt different the moment Naomi Carter picked up her leather travel bag. Nothing dramatic had happened, yet every person in the lounge sensed that the atmosphere had quietly transformed. The laughter that had echoed across the reception area earlier that afternoon had been replaced by thoughtful silence. The airport director walked beside Naomi toward the private boarding entrance, maintaining the same respectful professionalism he had shown from the moment he recognized her. Ground personnel waiting near the security gate immediately straightened their posture as the director approached. "Everything is ready, Ms. Carter," the operations supervisor said with a welcoming smile. "Your flight crew is awaiting your arrival." Naomi thanked him warmly. "I appreciate everyone's hard work." She spoke as though the delay had been nothing more than an ordinary inconvenience rather than an experience that had occupied an entire airport operations team. Ethan quietly stepped away from the reception desk and approached Naomi before she reached the boarding entrance. "Ms. Carter," he said respectfully, "I wanted to apologize. I should have trusted my instincts and made the verification call myself. Naomi smiled with genuine kindness. You asked the right question. Never stop asking questions when something does not feel complete. Good judgment begins with curiosity. Ethan nodded gratefully, recognizing that the lesson would remain with him long after the afternoon ended. Nearby travelers watched the exchange with quiet admiration. The retired airline captain smiled as he folded his newspaper. That, he whispered to the businessman seated beside him, is what real leadership sounds like. The businessman nodded. No speeches, no anger, just confidence. Diane Brooks remained behind the reception desk, reflecting on everything that had happened since Naomi first entered the terminal. She understood now that every opportunity to verify had also been an opportunity to prevent the delay. The airport director turned toward her before continuing to the boarding area. His voice remained calm and measured. Every guest deserves the same level of professional attention regardless of appearance, assumptions, or expectations. Our procedures are strongest when we follow them consistently. Diane answered quietly. I understand. I will remember that. There was no defensiveness in her voice now, only sincere reflection. Naomi paused for a brief moment before entering the secured boarding corridor. She looked back toward Diane and offered a small, respectful smile. Every person who walks through these doors deserves to be welcomed before they are evaluated, she said gently. Respect should never wait for confirmation. The simple sentence settled across the terminal more powerfully than any criticism could have. Diane nodded in appreciation, understanding that Naomi had chosen understanding over embarrassment. Outside, the polished Gulf Stream waited beneath the clear Texas sky, its cabin door open and the crew standing by the aircraft stairs. The captain stepped forward as Naomi approached. Welcome aboard, Ms. Carter, he said. We appreciate your patience. Naomi smiled. Thank you. I appreciate your professionalism. Behind them, the operations supervisor confirmed through his headset that boarding had officially begun. Inside the terminal, employees gradually returned to their normal responsibilities, yet every conversation carried a quieter tone than before. No one spoke about titles or wealth. Instead, they spoke about patience, professionalism, and the importance of verifying before reaching conclusions. As Naomi climbed the aircraft stairs with calm confidence, the people watching from the terminal windows realized they had witnessed something far more meaningful than an important passenger boarding a private jet. They had witnessed how quiet dignity could change an entire room without ever demanding attention. Naomi stepped into the cabin with the same quiet confidence she had carried from the moment she entered the executive terminal. The flight attendant welcomed her warmly and accepted her leather travel bag before guiding her to a comfortable seat beside the large oval window. Everything is ready whenever you are, she said with a friendly smile. Naomi thanked her and settled into the seat without the slightest sign that the afternoon had been anything other than an ordinary business trip. Outside, the captain completed the final exterior inspection while the first officer confirmed departure clearance with operations. The boarding stairs remained connected for only a few more minutes as ground personnel completed the final checklist. Near the terminal entrance, the airport director stood with the operations supervisor reviewing the sequence of events that had delayed the departure. Every communication had been automatically recorded through the airport operations system, creating a precise timeline from the first request for passenger confirmation until the moment Naomi had been officially recognized. The director closed the report and looked toward the terminal. The procedures worked, he said thoughtfully. The verification simply arrived later than it should have. The supervisor nodded. One phone call would have changed everything. Inside the reception area, Diane Brooks quietly organized her desk while reflecting on the afternoon. She understood now that professionalism was not measured by how quickly someone reached a conclusion, but by how carefully they verified it. Ethan returned to the reception counter carrying a stack of updated departure documents. I learned more today than I expected, he admitted. Diane offered a small smile. So did I. There was no embarrassment in her expression anymore, only sincere determination to improve. Across the lounge, the retired airline captain gathered his belongings before preparing for his own flight. As he passed the reception desk, he paused briefly. The best pilots I ever flew with, he said kindly, never believed they already knew every answer. They verified one more time. Diane thanked him quietly, understanding exactly what he meant. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long golden reflections across the polished surface of the Gulf Stream while the final baggage compartment was secured. The captain climbed the aircraft stairs and turned briefly toward the airport director. Both exchanged a simple nod that required no words. Inside the cabin, Naomi looked through the window toward the executive terminal one last time. She watched employees returning to their normal routines, travelers continuing toward their own departures, and ground crews preparing the next aircraft arriving on the schedule. Everything appeared ordinary again, yet she knew something valuable had changed. Procedures had been strengthened, perspectives had shifted, and a simple reminder about respect had quietly reached everyone who had witnessed the afternoon unfold. The flight attendant returned with a glass of water. "Thank you again for your patience today," she said. Naomi smiled warmly. Every experience offers an opportunity to learn. The flight attendant nodded appreciatively before returning to the galley. Moments later, the cabin door closed gently. Ground personnel removed the boarding stairs and disconnected the remaining service equipment. The operations supervisor confirmed through the radio that every departure requirement had finally been completed. From the observation window inside the terminal, Ethan watched the aircraft preparing to move. He realized that the most memorable part of the day had not been discovering who Naomi Carter was. It had been discovering how genuine character remained steady, whether someone was recognized immediately or only after every assumption had quietly disappeared. The cabin grew wonderfully quiet as the Gulf Stream began moving toward the runway beneath the warm glow of the late afternoon sun. Naomi Carter rested comfortably beside the window, watching the executive terminal slowly drift farther behind with every gentle turn of the aircraft. She accepted a cup of coffee from the flight attendant with a grateful smile and quietly thanked every member of the crew before returning her attention to the view outside. Nothing in her expression suggested triumph. Nothing suggested satisfaction that anyone had been proven wrong. Instead, there was only peaceful reflection. Beyond the window, ground personnel completed the final hand signals before stepping safely aside as the aircraft continued toward the departure runway. Inside the control tower, controllers confirmed every remaining clearance with their usual calm precision. "Runway is cleared for departure," the controller announced. The captain acknowledged the instruction, smoothly advanced the throttles, and the aircraft accelerated confidently across the pavement before lifting gracefully into the clear Texas sky. From the observation windows inside the executive terminal, Ethan watched the Gulf Stream climb steadily above the city skyline until it became a brilliant white silhouette against the afternoon sunlight. He smiled quietly, remembering every moment that had unfolded since Naomi first walked through the front entrance carrying nothing more than a leather travel bag and quiet confidence. Beside him, the airport director spoke softly while watching the aircraft disappear into the distance. "Some lessons improve an airport," he said. "Others improve the people working inside it." Ethan nodded. "I will never forget today." Back at the reception desk, Diane Brooks completed the final notes from the operational review before carefully closing the report. She understood now that experience alone could never replace verification, and assumptions could never replace respect. Every traveler deserved the same welcome before any conclusion had been reached. That realization stayed with her long after the terminal returned to its normal rhythm. New passengers entered through the front doors. New crews prepared additional departures. Yet every greeting Diane offered afterward carried a different tone, one shaped by greater patience and greater care than before. High above the clouds, Naomi looked out across an endless horizon painted with shades of gold and blue. She reflected on the many boardrooms, airports, and meetings she had visited throughout her career. Success had taught her that recognition often arrived late, but character always arrived first. Titles might open conversations. Wealth might attract attention. Achievement might earn admiration. Yet none of those things should ever determine whether another person deserved courtesy, dignity, or simple human respect. Those values should exist long before anyone knew a name, a profession, or a position. The aircraft continued smoothly toward its destination while sunlight filled the quiet cabin with a warm glow. Naomi smiled gently, grateful not because the misunderstanding had ended, but because an entire team had chosen to learn from it. Somewhere behind her, One young employee had discovered the importance of asking one more question. One experienced manager had rediscovered the value of careful verification. One airport director had reinforced the principles that define genuine leadership. And one executive terminal had quietly become a better place for every traveler who would walk through its doors in the future. Sometimes the greatest victories never appear on headlines or business reports. They live instead inside ordinary moments when patience overcomes assumption, professionalism overcomes pride, and respect is offered before identity is ever confirmed. As the Gulf Stream disappeared beyond the clouds, the journey left behind something far more lasting than a successful departure. It left behind a reminder that true leadership is never announced by status. It is recognized by the quiet dignity that remains unchanged before, during, and after the world finally learns who you are.